ready to start again for our final session. I feel kind of sad announcing our final session, but here we are. We're going to go global and think expansively about belonging all over the world. As John Powell reminded us, and our opening session this morning went deeply on, we're not concerned with what only happens here or in our local places, as we know the dynamics of othering and belonging are deeply interconnected. So it's only fitting we have global leaders here who have spent their entire careers in peace building and advocating for justice and human rights. Moderating this conversation, I have the honor of introducing a brilliant thinker, scholar, speaker, writer, and poet who has flown halfway across the world to lead this conversation today. Come on, yes. Now based in Paris, Kathryn Nwajiaku-Dahou is a British-Nigerian political scientist and the director of politics and governance at ODI, a global affairs think tank. At the Institute, we have been lucky to get to know Kathryn through her engagement with our Democracy and Belonging Forum in Europe, a transatlantic network committed to bridging across lines of difference to counter far-right authoritarian populism. Kathryn will lead this conversation with 3 thought leaders in a collective exploration of belonging without othering as a global frame and a collective aspiration, and what is required to build that future together. So please welcome Kathryn and her panel, who she's about to introduce you to.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Kathryn, and this is my esteemed panel. So what can I say about myself? I go by the pronouns her, she. I'm a black woman with brown, toffee-colored skin and dark-rimmed glasses, which I constantly remove as they no longer do the perfect job. I have a small hereditary gap in the middle of my front teeth, of which I'm very proud. And I have thick, brownish, red, short, twisted braids that crown my head that are piled up. And I'm wearing a mustard and black speckled jacket over black t-shirt and trousers and my special black high-heeled boots. Right, here we go. So, we have the pleasure of this final panel, which gives us the opportunity of looking back whilst looking forward. We've invited global leaders, as has been said, who have decades of experience in peace building and human rights. And we're going to ask them all to share their experiences with us and offer ideas and a vision to help us all build a better future together. And we're asking them also to inspire us, so a tall order, rather than allow us to leave here sinking in despair. So what we want to look at is peace building, and to talk to people who have worked on peace, in context of war. So let me just say a few words just to provide a little backdrop to this session. So as has been said by so many of us over the last few days, we are at a critical point. We know that in the world, so beyond America, but in the world, 80% of humanitarian crises are the result of violent conflict. Many of these conflicts, sadly, are taking place in Africa and are likely to continue to do so over the next few decades. And, they're all over the place. So it's not just poor countries, but rich countries that are experiencing what is the result of huge stresses, huge forms of transformation that we're all undergoing. So we want to know from our esteemed guests, what they've done. What they've done to try and counter or address some of these multifold challenges that we're all facing. So without further ado, let me turn to my first panelist on my right, whose name is Kilmurray. Avila, is the Migration and Peacebuilding Executive at the Social Change Initiative. She occupies a role which supports work with the Migrant Learning Exchange Program and has extensive experience on peacebuilding. She's worked in the community of philanthropy, but particularly on the Northern Ireland peace process and conflict since 1975. She has a particular interest in women's issues and anti-poverty work. She was the founder member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and over the period from 1994 to 2014, she was the director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland. Welcome, Avila. And next to Avila, we have Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, a British-Iranian author and founder and executive director of ICANN, which is the International Civil Society Action Network. She's been a peace strategist working on conflict, crises, and violent extremism, and has been a consultant in the UN, the United Nations, on the subject of women and conflict. At LSE, the London School of Economics, she was the director of the Centre for Women, Peace and Security since December 2019, and she has many other accolades, but we have to keep to time. Welcome, Sanam. And finally, we have Shamil Idriss, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Search for Common Ground. It's the world's largest dedicated peace-building organization. He's currently based in Washington, and in his capacity as CEO and in previous roles as President, Chief Operating Officer, and Burundi Country Director, Shamil has led Search for Common Ground's efforts to end violent conflict in more than 35 countries. So we really are going global here. And you know, that includes some of the most devastating conflict zones in the Middle East and Africa. He was appointed in 2005 by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan as the Deputy Director of the UN Alliance of Civilization. So we are amongst esteemed guests here. Welcome. Welcome, Shamil. So, let us begin. I want to turn to you, Sanam, with a first question. So, in a minute, can you tell us one thing that has really struck you about what we've been discussing over the last few days, or one thing from your role in peace building that you think you want to bring to this conversation at this moment? Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be here. I work internationally, and I live in Washington. I've lived in Washington for 22 years. Now I'm in Berlin for a few months. And I don't often get to talk to American audiences. And I have become an American citizen in the last couple of years. And it's, you know, the sense of belonging and thinking that this country is also mine is a new feeling, actually. So it's really a privilege to be here. What can I tell you about what we can share? There's lots that we can share from our field of work with the work that's happening here. But one thing that I would like to share from my work with, especially with women, my organization, our model is that we're very small, but we have a network of over 90 partner organizations in 42 countries. They're all women-led peace-building organizations in some of the world's worst conflict-affected areas. And they inspire me all the time because if you can have a child who has died in war and use that trauma and that pain to think about the future and to think about not wanting others to experience your pain, that's something to learn from. And for me personally, this is a similar thing. I was 11 when I left Iran at the time of the revolution. And I got into this field because I didn't want others to experience what I experienced. So bringing it to the specific question, I think that one of the most effective ways that I've found in my work and how I bridge the long bridge, the short bridge, these issues that we've talked about, is by facing someone and asking them, male or female, but often with men, what is it they want for their daughters and their sons? I've asked this question of Taliban leaders. I've asked it in Jamaica of gang members. I've asked it of military leaders from Myanmar. I've talked about this with army folks in the United Kingdom. And what I've realized is, first of all, as a 5'5" woman, I'm not a threat to them, right? It's a disarming thing, the interaction that I have. But when you put it like that and you situate an issue in their circle of belonging, to the people they care about, it opens up a conversation. And the gang member, just to give you an example, I was talking to 40 gang guys with bullet holes and God knows. And I asked this question of one of them, and I said, what do you want for your kids? And he said, I want them to have good table manners and a good education and to speak properly. I have children, and I looked at him and I said, yeah, me too. And from there, we had a conversation that took us in a whole other place that otherwise would have happened between me coming with my UN hat and, gang member X, who's probably got an M16 under his bed, but was able to engage. So that finding a point of connectivity and then linking it to the future we want. Thinking about how the future we want shapes our present actions and allows us to deal with the past. This I think, is one of the areas of work that I think would be really useful for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sanam. I think that's very, very linked to what we've been talking about, finding those threads of commonality that allow us to go beyond our individual differences. I would ask you again, and maybe I'll come to this later, but how has that helped in the long run? Is that gang member in Jamaica still holding his AK-47? Is that Taliban still in power? And do the lines that we create of commonality get us where we need to get to? But that's for later. I'm going to come to you now, Avila, and ask you the same question. What's your big takeaway from the last few days? What struck you?
I think what struck me was the emphasis on creativity and imagination and curiosity. And I think for me, having lived through the conflict in Northern Ireland since 1975, and then being part of the peace process, those were essential elements in getting ourselves out of the narrowness of conflict. And I think one of the problems is, when you're living and working in violent conflict, is that there's no oxygen left to think on a broader basis, and you get caught in boxes, and people box you. I was saying earlier, we have a folk song in Northern Ireland that came out in the middle of our conflict, called "Whatever You Say Nothing." In other words, being Irish, we can talk at length, but you don't say anything in case someone can find out something about you or put you in a box. And that stunts imagination and creativity. And the reality is, for all conflicts, old problems need new questions asked to them. And that really is where imagination is so important. And for us, actually, one of the things that really helped us, I think, in terms of our conflict was, yes, having sort of local ownership of a peace process, but also having people from outside of our little area coming in and posing questions. Because if I'd asked it, probably people from the other side wouldn't have heard it or would have read something into it that may not have been there, but they would have seen it as adversarial. But when somebody came in from South Africa and asked it, it changed the whole context. And people then started to think. And that made a huge difference for us.
Thank you very much. It suggests the importance of having a global conversation, precisely to see what it is that new eyes bring to a situation where one is boxed in. So this leap of faith, this imaginary that will allow you to get out of a box is really important. We'll come to more on that later, but I want to come to you now, Shamil, and ask you what your 1-minute reflections are on the last few days. What's your big takeaway?
Thank you. I'm a little over 6 foot tall, dark jeans, bald, goateed, wearing a gold jacket fit for a Bond villain. We're
quite well matched, actually, I think.
Yeah. I've loved the last couple of days. I feel really privileged to be here. I really want to thank the organizers. This is an incredibly inspiring community of people. I think 2 takeaways related to one another. One is this very inspiring vision of can we make belonging a global norm? I think it's triggered for me the question about what it will take to develop the temperament, which I think is an important piece of this that gets overlooked. The temperament, the skills, and the courage to integrate the principles of belonging, not just in the outcome we seek, but in the activism and the process we take to get there. It's a very overstated for a reason maxim of Gandhi that you will need to be the change you want to create in the world. What that actually means in practice, in my experience, and the people I have the real privilege to represent here, my colleagues and partners, is really very difficult. Specifically, if you define who you're going to engage across difference by who has constituency, not necessarily who agrees with you. Because if we're really going to engage across constituency, it takes a lot of work, a lot of courage, and it's challenging. Someone was remarking, Pastor Bob was here on the stage, and someone was remarking how, he's the one in to a certain community that's really important in this country. I think that's a problem to reflect on if that's our one in, and he's brilliant. I have to end with one quick thing on Pastor Bob. I was one of the Muslims who had the privilege to be on the front row in his mega church when he first started bringing us, to his church. And I was sitting next to Prince Turkey, who he referenced, who's a mutual friend, when Bob had his rock band, literally, church rock band, and we all had glow sticks we had been given to wave in the air while they were playing. I don't even know if Bob knows this, but Prince Turkey leaned over to me and he said, "Could you imagine this happening in any mosque in the world?" Not really. Anyway, very quickly, the second thing is whether we can weave belonging into the everyday practices without having to wait for a breakdown. It's oftentimes the case that you have to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough. When a breakdown comes in the form of tens of thousands of people murdered or mass violence, the real question is, do we have to wait for that? I was so inspired by Roberto Badaya, the cultural affairs manager for Oakland, when he talked about that program of bringing artists in with the policymakers. Yeah. And I had the privilege of sitting with him over dinner that night, and he said to me, one of the things that struck him is when one of them, after they got to know one another, said, "You actually care." Just that basic of him, and he didn't do that out of crisis, but when and if there is a crisis in this city, my sense is that relationship that he's forged, those relationships he's forged during a period of non-crisis could really come in handy. And I wish we had the Hillel Students Association, the Muslim Students Association, all these being put on leadership panels together on colleges long before this war broke out.
Some excellent observations there about this being a state of mind issue, first of all, a disposition that we have to cultivate. And then secondly, investing in that building of relationships before the proverbial hits the fan, before things get really bad. So I think we kind of hold on to those thoughts as we move through this conversation. And I want to turn to you, Sanam, and ask you to help us as we think about, we refer to local peace building, you referred to it, the women who have inspired you. Can you break it down for us? Because we are a little niche community, this peace building lot. So for audience that aren't familiar, what is peace building? What's local peace building when it's at home or not?
Thank you. I forgot to describe myself. I have brown hair and a ponytail. I'm wearing a blue and white squiggly top and navy blue pants, and I'm middle-aged and middle-aged, basically, and female. Yeah.
And beautiful.
Yeah. So thank you. So let me can I give you a few stories of what I'm talking about? So first of all, when I first got into this work, I was working for an organization in London that's called International Alert. It's one of the oldest peace-building organizations. And what we found was that the women in the organization, as we talked about issues, as we talked about civil war, as we talked about what happened in the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, and what was happening in Burundi at that time, we were talking in very practical terms around, okay, things are about what do you do? Who on the ground is taking action? And the men in the organization were talking about institutions and structures and very theoretical. And we had the first meeting, global meeting of women from war zones from around the world in London in 1998. And we had Guatemalans, and we had Israeli and South Africans, and Rwandese, and all these women. And some were talking about being victims of war. Some were talking about how they picked up weapons and become fighters and freedom fighters. And there was a Rwandan woman who stood up on stage, and she talked about the need for peace and reconciliation and thinking about the future. So this future, for me, this bridge to the future is very important. It was 4 years after the genocide. I discovered that she had lost 100 relatives in that genocide. I come from a big family. We were uprooted. The only place we feel genuine belonging is in our family. And I kept thinking, what would I do if I lost a relative? And I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to think about that. It was too painful. But what I realized is that there are people like her all over the world. And that's why I started working on women, and that's why we went to the Security Council, and it was a global movement to get a Security Council resolution. And then at some point I thought, well, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I've done research on Northern Ireland and South Africa, and they were the special cases. You know, they're the exceptions. But the more I worked in this field, I have been with Syrians who at the beginning of the war, one was an engineer, one was an architect. They started a community organization, and they were saying, why is everyone giving us weapons to kill each other? Why is no one helping us to talk to each other? Think about it. My colleague who's Yemeni was a poet. The Yemen war broke out because the Security Council and our government voted to allow the Saudis to bomb Yemen. And she was helping to negotiate the passage of humanitarian aid and actually medical aid for kids with cancer. And she had to talk to the armed groups. And so she was mediating. And then she realized on their side there was no food, so she decided to open bakeries. And they opened a bakery here and a bakery there, and it became a bridge. And I have so many of these stories. You asked about the Taliban and so forth. I have a colleague in Nigeria who works on Boko Haram issues. And she has managed to negotiate with the Boko Haram and pull these guys out, pull the women and girls out. And when they come out, they're not necessarily fully de-radicalized in their thinking. So she works with them emotionally, psychologically, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of reframing what religion might be. Same in Pakistan, that they are working with women and men and giving them alternative options. And it's really situated in seeking the humanity and asking people, because people have aspirations, they have grievances, they are genuine aspirations and grievances. If you talk to neo-fascists in various countries that they now exist, I bet you would find amongst them an ability to find something genuinely that has hurt them and is a way of bringing them out and reframing them and seeking that humanity. So peace builders do this. They're able to hold multiple truths. They're able to look at complexity. They're able to have a fundamental understanding of what it means to have universal rights, like believing in human rights for all of us, including the other, but at the same time thinking about how do we bridge it and take it forward so that we're not doing this again. And this, when I think about Gaza and I think about Israel, in 2002, an Israeli and a Palestinian woman went to the Security Council at a time when Israeli and Palestinian civil society wasn't allowed to talk to each other. And they said, we are willing to talk and not shoot. We are willing to sit on the same side of the table
Think about it, same side of the table and look together at our joint destiny. This is what we have to do. And in this country, we need to do that, guys. We need to do that. And so this is what peace building is. It's very hard, it's complicated, but it brings out the most extraordinary aspects of humanity. And once you find that connection, you can't dehumanize the other one.
Yeah.
It's about humanizing, and once you've done it, once you've had that experience, you cannot unsee the humanity.
Fantastic. So, I mean, if we're linking it back to some of the conversations we've been having over these last few days, I mean, it's this search for common humanity that's really important. But what I'm also hearing from what you're saying is the importance of agency. So it's really the women that you've been meeting have been at the center. It's the women who are setting the tone for the conversation about reconciliation to be had. Because, you know, and because there are practices of peace building that are also contrary to that. You know, I also started my career in 1994, precisely on the Rwanda genocide. And I was appalled by what I saw as passing for peace building. So 6 months after the genocide, I was working for an organization that was talking about reconciliation. I was astounded. Wonderful to hear what you're saying as alternatives that were coming through 4 years later, but very much led by as women as agents. I want to turn to you now, Avila, and ask you what your thoughts are. What's local peace building for you? Does it resonate? Is it a concept that you use, actually, being not just someone who works on conflict, but in conflict?
Yes, and I'm also, must describe myself, I'm small, stocky, not fat, stocky. White Irish woman, brown hair going slightly grey because of my advanced age, and because I'm over 70, I've got a purple overshirt.
Lilac.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, I mean, for me, locally driven peace building is really what makes peace processes sustainable. And most, to be quite honest, of our peace processes have not been sustainable because in the broader sort of geopolitics, it is all about crisis management. It's not about rootedness, it's about crisis management. But if we want to actually to avert the sort of othering syndrome, then it has to be locally rooted. And like Sanam, I worked a lot with women. I worked as a community activist for 15 years, and we have very divided communities in Northern Ireland, what we call single identity communities, because people moved or displaced because of fear. We still have in our small area over 100 peace walls, 12-foot high walls that actually divide local communities in terms of where they live. So that is sort of what fear actually leads to. But again, it was women that actually made the effort in the course of the violence, while the violence was still going on, to actually meet with each other around those walls. And what they were actually saying was, we're actually curious about what's happening on the other side of the wall, because the politicians on either side are saying that they have got benefits that we don't. So they actually wanted to find out themselves. And for 15 years, the last Friday of every month, we brought women's groups from largely working class, poor areas, urban and rural, together, to sit together. Now, we were not dictated by some externally funded peace program, which wanted outcomes in 2 years' time. The point was, we sort of said to the women, it's at your pace, you decide the agenda, and it's in your terms. And very sorry to say this, we actually barred all academics because they talked in terms that no one could understand. And we had a local woman as the coordinator, working class woman, Kathleen Feenan. And Kathleen would say, well, she said, my idea of peace building is if I see that somebody from the other community has not turned up to 2 meetings, rather than, sort of make suppositions about that, she says, I buy an apple tart. And she says, I get on my bicycle and I bring the apple tart and I knock at their door, and then they have to invite me in for a cup of tea. And then she says, I find out what's going on. Is it because they were intimidated by their paramilitaries not to come? Is it because the person that was driving their car was sick? Is it because they couldn't get childcare? So, and that's the essence of actually building local relationships. Now, in all the time that group kept meeting, and was big meetings, they were never asked to talk about reconciliation, about peacemaking. They decided the agenda, and more often than not, it was about how they were going to get money to buy the school uniform, or how they were going to visit a son or a daughter in prison, or what happened when their brother was shot dead. But over tea and coffee, they talked to each other without it being formalized into some sort of program. And that's where the relationships were built. And they were the women whose brothers and daughters and husbands and fathers were active paramilitaries. So that's where the conversation started. And I think it was Václav Havel that once said, democracy doesn't start with elections, it starts with conversations. And that's what locally based peace building is.
Thanks so much, Avila. I mean, it's so rich. And, every time I listen to you speak, it resonates so strongly because the Northern Ireland, what we used to call in the UK, Troubles, have been such a centerpiece of background to my life. And the conflict that was never declared its name while I was growing up in London. So the more I meet you, the more this unraveling is really very powerful. And how to make peace over a cup of tea, I just love it. As a Brit. So, and you said other really important things about the threads of trust building or relationship building. I think you used the word relationship more than anything. And I want to turn to you now, Shamil, and ask you about this question of relationship building and trust. Because you often hear, in our circles, it's all about trust. You just have to build trust, and But can you unpack that a bit for us?
So there are all these management journals, Harvard Business Review, whatever, that have been showing that the most effective teams are the most diverse teams, right? Whether it's in management of a company or it's editorial board of a paper, whatever. What they don't say is that the least effective teams are also the most diverse teams. It's the non-diverse teams that make up this mediocre middle, where you can oftentimes get pretty good performance but not outstanding results. And I'm sharing this because it connects to this point I was making about both what you're talking about now, which is what is local, and what I was saying just before this about who has constituency, and combining those two things. Because the difference between those sort of the non-diverse teams, you don't have to work hard to build trust. You went to the same schools, you follow the same music, you speak with the same accent, you kind of have the same shorthand. Diverse teams, the ones that perform incredibly well and outperform everyone else, are the ones where the time has been taken to build trust. And diverse teams where you haven't built that trust, people are wondering, if I say this, is she going to think wrongly of me? If I do that, are they going to think I'm this? Or I don't know, I'm uncomfortable, I'm uncertain, we haven't. And so this is, to me, a microcosm of what's happening globally, because we're increasingly interconnected, increasingly diverse. The problems that we have to solve are increasingly complicated and connected to one another. And the only way we're going to meet them is by mobilizing across our differences. And the only way we can do that effectively is to build that trust. So how do you connect this to locally led peace building? I think that the most effective peace building teams and networks are not just local. absolutely local, but also what I would call multi-partial, which means they're not impartial or neutral, they're not observers, they're not third parties. They are drawn from the very communities who are affected by the conflict, and they have unique insight and collective wisdom. And that's where, and it takes a lot of time to support and build that kind of a network. But when that is done, what you see is only that kind of collective group can sit there and say, with a youth activist, a community activist, a former gang leader, a retired police officer sitting there together on the same side of the table facing a common problem, rather than sitting each other as the problem, they can say, look, if we use that word, nobody in my community is going to talk to us. If we do something in that neighborhood, every door is going to open, because that is the key to everything. And if you can get people across these dividing lines in any community, here in the US, in Mali, in Afghanistan, wherever it is, I'll just give a very quick example. You know, the only Afghan woman leading an international organization in that country today is Zura Bahman, who leads our team there and has tripled the size of that team in programming since the Taliban took over. And the day after they took over, the entire team was at home. They were doing the most Afghan thing I've ever heard. They were having a poetry competition on WhatsApp. And somebody said, what are we going to do tomorrow? And Zura said, look, why don't the women stay home? I will go with the men. I'll see if we can get to the office. They got to the office. About 30 feet in front of the office was a police checkpoint that's always been there, except now it was manned by soldiers with machine guns. And she directed Abrar, the director of program, she said, go out there and offer them the same thing we offered the police, because it's August, it's very hot. So he went out there and he said, you know, if you get thirsty, we have a water spout on the outside of our office. You can fill your canteens with that. 45 minutes later, banging on the door, opens the door. Thank you so much for the water. Can we pray in your courtyard? Because it's really busy on the street and there are a lot of us. Well, now that's awkward. And Zura says, you know, we are a community-based organization. We have a lot of visitors. They'd be intimidated if they're men with guns, you know, in the courtyard. How about this? You know, maybe could you do it for no more than a week, but within a week find another solution? They agreed. Every single day has been this grant respect, try to hold position while acknowledging the power difference is insane, and that kind of navigation, that kind of, you know, we call it Aikido politics. If you look at the martial art of Aikido, the goal of the martial art of Aikido is to get both you and your attacker to a safe space. So if you go on YouTube and watch an Aikido master, you'll never see them hit anybody. They're always deflecting the attacks, exhausting their attacker. Locals, people who are from the communities affected by conflict, who represent the dividing lines in that conflict, and I will say this for the conflict that's on a lot of people's minds right now, if there's going to be a political agreement between Israel and Palestine, it's going to be made by ardent Zionists and staunch Palestinian nationalists. That's who's going to forge it, if it's going to happen. And that might be uncomfortable for people to hear, but the effort then to build those relationships across those dividing lines now and every day after this war ends is going to be vital, in my view.
Thank you so much. I loved Aikido politics, you know, making sure that you and your so-called adversary get to the finishing line both intact. That's a really wonderful image to have in mind, but also I think it highlights just the work, the effort that this is going to take. And I just also want to acknowledge what you said about the conflict that is on all our minds, which is only going to be resolved if we have the most ardent Zionists and the most, you know, nationalist Palestinians making the peace together. And so what that means in terms of building relationships, I see you smiling with two fingers over your mouth, Sanam. I think that suggests that you really have something to say. Would you like to come in here?
So do we need the ardent Zionists and the nationalists there? Yes. So that's necessary. Is that sufficient for peace? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What we know is we need the violent actors at the table to end the fighting. But when it comes to actually fostering peace, genuine peace, you need the people. And I think that in the case of what we're saying in terms of Palestine and in terms of Israel, what I would suggest is that you need a people's peace process in Palestine for themselves and a parallel people's peace process in Israel for themselves, for them to determine for themselves how they want to engage with the other side, and have these two parallel processes going on. But if you leave it only to the violent, just think about that. If we only ever talk to people who have been willing to kill their own or kill the people of the other, then we're rewarding violence. And what it would have meant is that we should have armed the women of Afghanistan, made them really violent, and then we would have invited them to Qatar and they could have stayed in hotels. That model we need those guys, but it is not sufficient. It is not sufficient in this country, it's not sufficient over there.
Brilliant. I mean, I think this is the heart of the matter. And I want to invite you also, Avila, to give us your take on this, because perhaps, talking to the enemy is necessary, but not sufficient. What's the experience of Northern Ireland shown us?
Yes, I agree with Sanam on this one. Absolutely, you need the whole range of people there. But the trouble is with a lot of, particularly externally managed peacemaking, it tends to be that you either have to bring guns or a huge number of votes. And that becomes politics and peacemaking. And what we found was, and at the end of the day, our peace process did include people from the various paramilitary or political parties related to paramilitary organizations as well. Well, we took the initiative and set up a women's political party, because when we looked at who was going to be at the table, there would be no woman at the table in Northern Ireland in the peace process. So we looked round and sort of said, well, we have all this experience at local community level that's not going to be reflected by the boys at the table. So we said, initially, we sent out a questionnaire to the parties about a whole range of issues, social and economic issues. Are you going to raise these? And they ignored us. So we said, right. 6 weeks to go before the election, we formed the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And we got elected. Now, how we actually then incorporated, if you like, peace building in that process was, first of all, we had two leaders. We had co-leaders, one from the Unionist Protestant community, one from the Catholic Nationalist community. We had a membership base and candidates that were from both communities. And that's how we actually got over the othering. And we didn't spend our time having large number of the policies, because actually we reckoned we were never going to be the Minister for Agriculture, so why have a chicken rearing policy? What we had instead was three values: human rights, equality, and inclusion. Everyone should be at the table. So when a difficult crisis issue came along, we didn't start in by jumping on that and arguing around that, which would immediately divide people. We said, take a step back and let's look at it through a value. So we were asked by a mother whose daughter was being held on remand in prison in England for alleged IRA bombing. She was pregnant and she was being strip searched repeatedly. The mother came and said, I want you to make a statement on this. So there was a danger that our group would split, because they say, oh, that's a Republican propaganda. So instead, we said, look, we will look at this through the lens of human rights, and we will send a member of ours who happened to be a Protestant woman doctor over to the prison to see the girl. Jane came out and said, this is an abuse of human rights. And because we did that sort of countervailing approach, that was heard. Whereas if I'd done it, they would have said, oh, well, she would say that anyway. But by having groups like that at the table, it meant that the extremes on either side also had someone to actually listen to what both were saying, and we ended up reinterpreting it for them, because they were so caught in what they thought was knowing what the others were saying and not hearing what they were saying. And I always sort of said, my mother once said to me, you're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them proportionately. And actually, in peace processes, that's very useful.
Thank you. I love that, the 2 ears and 1 mouth philosophy. I mean, I think there are so many resonances with what we've been hearing over the last few days. It reminds me of what Maurice was saying yesterday about the importance of organizing and his own political party, and the importance of listening rather than presuming we know what the other side is thinking. He also used a metaphor of strategic chess game as thinking about politics as that. And what you've described here is really very much about being strategic, intelligent, about the way you deploy all the resources at your disposal. And you can do that, one, because you have a value-based proposition as a political party, inclusion, human rights, equality. And also you have both sides leading the organization. This seemed to contrast a little bit with what you were suggesting. Maybe this is a different context. We also have to remember while we tell these stories, the different contexts throw up their own necessities. So you described, Sanam, the need for a people's-centered peace process in Israel and a people's-centered peace movement in Palestine. Could you say a little bit more about that and how you think about what Avila's just said in relation to that?
So again, I think the context is different because the Israel-Palestine situation is, you could argue it's two-state. It's two different states. It's interstate, if you want, as opposed to just internal, although it's because of the nature of the occupation is different. But what I'm saying is that when you have had your politicians fail you, it's the failure of politics that has led to genocide, right? International, national. When you've had that happen, it is important to give recognition to those who have sought to deal with the conflict and the consequences of the conflict non-violently. So to me, when I look at the situation in Palestine and Israel right now, I would say, first of all, we need a ceasefire right now, today, right? And now. And then, instead of saying, oh, now we have a political process, and let's bring literally the same old guys, it is the same men repeatedly meeting, same Americans, same Israelis, same Palestinians, it's a definition of insanity. That's, instead of having that, saying, okay, imagine that you end up having a process where your representation from your medical, from your doctors, from your teachers, from your women's organizations, from your mosque, from your churches, from the political parties, from the youth movements, from the youth, the country is, Palestinians, it's overwhelmingly young people, right? Victims' families, get together and say, where are we going? What do we need? What do we want? We're going to be living next door to these people. Same with Israel. Bring them all together. And as Israelis decide, how are we going to live next door to each other, whether it's neighbors or whether it's estates, but let the people decide their own future because the politicians have failed them. One of the things that in the discourse that we have is there's always talk of power sharing, right? Oh, we should bring the politicians, and in the case of, as Avila was saying, he wants to be Minister of Agriculture and the other one wants to be Minister of Finance. I was working in Somalia and there was a famine going on and these guys are walking around saying they wanted to be Minister of this and Minister of that. As international actors, as the UN, we should stop using the term power sharing. We should start saying responsibility sharing, because if you're going to become Minister of Finance in a war zone, you better know how you're going to get water and food to people. Power is for me. Responsibility is about everybody else. So these terms and reframing how we look at issues, I think, is very important. But holding the political actors and holding the armed actors accountable, letting them understand that they're only there because they're violent. They're only there because they can garner some votes, and we're not quite sure how. There are other actors in that space, and they happen to be doing the acting using peace and using dialogue and not having to hide behind guns.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's a tension here. I think there's a tension here, perhaps in the perspectives in the panel. I just want to really draw them out now. Here we are.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And I think it's this question of power, how we understand power. Shamil has spoken also about the importance of acknowledging who holds constituency. And we, in this conference, have been speaking about the importance of telling a new story. That's what you seem to be suggesting. So are these propositions in tension? Shamil?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting that, I said, I believe, that peace building will need to happen between ardent Zionists and staunch Palestinian nationalists. And somehow we went to governments of just men negotiating. That's not what I said.
Right, clarify.
And I think part of why I said Zionists in this crowd is that I want to be very open. I mean, I came back from Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv 3 weeks ago. And I've got team members, colleagues who have lost family in Gaza. We have an equally Israeli and Palestinian team and network. I want to be really clear about something. In today's world, authority and influence have become split. It used to be that those who were in these formal positions of authority also had all of the influence because of the way structures were. Today, if you forge a peace agreement in Mali, if you invite a bunch of ministers, mostly if not entirely men, and nobody's talking not only to the women, but the young people, the young guy who's got 5,000 people in his WhatsApp network in the very region where Boko Haram is recruiting from, and you don't involve him somehow in the process, you're lost. So I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with what's being said. And being the one man on the panel, let me just say, it's the most stunningly obvious. I mean, the research is so overwhelming, it's absurd we have to even say this. If you look at the research of peace agreements where there have been women signatories, they are much more successful and long-lasting. They're much more comprehensive. They don't just take up issues of who's going to have which power. They take up a lot of these. Sanam's point about response, couldn't agree more. Where I don't know whether there's a disagreement, but what I was trying to throw into the room to be a little bit provocative is that having come back from Israel and Palestine that recently, I met with hardly anybody, from the most ardent and effective peace builders to hostage negotiators to pretty right-wing folks who wouldn't describe themselves as Zionist. And one of them told me, I'm so glad to work in this organization because I don't think any other peace organization here would have me. And I said, why? She said, I'm too religious and I'm too Zionist, despite the fact that she has taken great risks to defend the rights of Palestinians and advocate. And I think what I'm trying to point out is that these terms, if we're in a community where we very much believe in allowing people to define their identities for themselves, what does it mean to be feminist or post-feminist? What does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be Muslim? I think we also need to afford that courtesy to somebody who self-describes as a Zionist, because I know very, very aggressive, warmongering, self-described Zionists, and I know some of the most courageous peace builders who describe themselves that way, because they don't necessarily define it the way that outsiders engaging in that conflict define them. So that's what I was trying to provoke. But I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with everything that the two of you have said.
Thank you. I mean, I think it was really important to draw those things out, and just because these are the tricky bits of the conversation we've been having over the last few days, where we have spoken about be careful how you define the devil. That was what John said yesterday, and we've also been talking about bridging. So I do think, some of these questions need to be clarified. I want to kind of move us on. We've got 8 more minutes left. And I want to ask you all to just reflect on this question of imagination. We've spoken about it over the last few days, the importance of creativity. You mentioned it, Avila. And I want you to give us your take, particularly in terms of what a leap of faith means when you are speaking to someone or encouraging people to speak to each other who've respectively killed each other's family members. I say that because in the context of war that you've all experienced, this is what peace building takes. So I want to turn to you first, Avila, and ask you to tell us a little bit about what tricks in the trade you've used to have a leap of faith in these contexts.
Well, there's a number of situations, I suppose, I've been in where that has happened. I mean, first of all, when I was in the Community Foundation, I managed a lot of the European Union peace funds for Northern Ireland, including all the funding for the reintegration of all the political prisoners and the very initial funding for the support for the victims of violence and survivors of violence. And they were actually, that last grouping were the ones that were completely ignored until the very end of our peace process, because they didn't bring that sort of, I suppose, constituency with them. And in terms of the work, so with the prisoners, I actually had for about 12 years them meeting around the table, 3 representatives from each of 5 paramilitary groups, 3 Republican, 2 Loyalists, who had killed each other. And there, really what they wanted to suss out was where the other side were coming from, could they trust them, and to sort of build, again, and I actually talk more about relationships than trust, because trust comes and goes depending on circumstances. But relationships, I think, do hold better. And it was working at a range of different levels, you know, to encourage them to work together on community-based projects that benefited their respective communities. But by doing that, they also build the relationship. So when their formal negotiators were meeting, the negotiators would be coming back to these, and they were virtually men, all men, these guys on the ground and saying, what are you hearing? What are you picking up? You know, what's been said in that community? And that then gave a sort of a degree of stability to the negotiations going forward. So I think that was very important. What I actually found was it was much easier to work with the people that had the guns than with some of the political parties that represented them. And actually, some of the more extreme political parties, at the end of the day, did walk away from the peace process, but the paramilitary-related parties stayed. And that was the difference. The sort of, and one of the things, and I think that was mentioned, the last contribution, is, you know, to not think in terms of categories. I always remember Gerry Adams saying to me, the hardest thing for me as a Sinn Féin Republican side is actually negotiating internally with my own people. And was actually given the space for that to happen was really, really important. But the other thing that actually that I was very affected by was the use of drama and the arts as creating some non-adversarial space for people where one had been involved in killing another. I mean, we've used the theatre of witness, which we, I think, stole from Colombia, and I remember, you know, a staging which was between Anne, who was a released Irish Republican Army volunteer, who was involved as a combatant, and a woman called Kathleen Gillespie, whose husband had been made a human bomb and blown up by the IRA. Now, it was a very long process, but they talked together and then produced this theatre of witness where they actually were sharing the human story of where they were coming from. And it was that sort of all the time, that human story that actually brought people together to get to transcend, if you like, the othering that would have happened. What I think is more difficult, though, is a situation, and we very often have it in peace processes, where people are coming from different narratives. And in our situation, what made it sometimes very difficult to bring people who had been in combat together, particularly people who perhaps were slightly at one remove, was those from the unionist community where the British government's narrative was saying, this is not a political struggle, it's an aggravated crime wave. And those from the Republican community who saw it as the politics of working towards a united Ireland rather than being part of Britain. And when people get caught in that narrative, it is very difficult to then actually start that discussion. And that's where we would have used external people coming in from Nicaragua, and ironically, actually, in 1999, around the time that our agreement, from the Middle East. because at that stage, they were in advance of us. And I always remember from that period, Shimon Peres said that one of the problems was that in those sort of negotiations with your adversary, it's 50% suspicion, 40% the past, and 10% the future. And that's one of the problems. That's one of the things that we actually have to work on, to shift those percentages in order to try and get peace to hold. And the last thing I'll say as a tactic, if you like, it was vital to us to have what we called insider-outsiders. In other words, people that were not necessarily part of the combatant group or the more extremist group, but whose brother was, or whose father was, or whose sister was. So I never asked, as a community activist for many years during the conflict, I never asked permission to do things. But I had enough of a network to go along to Sean or to Jimmy and say, I'm thinking of doing this. And I'd say, oh, that's a great idea. I'd say, oh, let me come back to you in 24 hours' time about that. And sometimes I would come back and say, good idea, but I wouldn't do it just now. So in other words, you sort of set up a sort of a little internal secret service, which was important, but it went across constituencies so that you got a sense of the pace and what you could do. And again, your insider outsider was able to say, that's a great idea, but don't call it that. Call it this. Again, the importance of words.
Fantastic. I'm just aware. It's so rich, the experience that you bring to this conversation, that I didn't want to stop you, but I want to invite our other panelists, Sanam and Shamil, to perhaps say a few last remarks regarding the tips of the trade.
Are we allowed 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I want to share with you a verse that is etched on the UN at the United Nations. It's a 12th century Persian verse, and it goes like this. The translation of it is this. It says, human beings are members of a whole, the creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted and with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. This is from the 12th century, and it's about belonging. Thank you. My staff goes crazy because I walk into the office every day and I have 15 ideas, and they say we can't do all this. But I'm talking to an audience here, so I can just throw out these, as you said, imagined ideas. So hope is great, but it's not a strategy, and we need some action. And if we have any lawyers in the room, if we have any accountants in the room, if we have any social sort of governmental folks in the room, foundations in the room, I have some ideas for you. So, for the accountants, as we all know, the Pentagon, by the way, this year has a budget of $825 billion. Next year, it's $849 billion of our taxes, and doesn't get audited. Imagine if all of our accounting firms and all of our accounting students around in the country offered their services pro bono to audit and take the extra money for our social services. So, accountants, to our foundations, please work with us in civil society. We call it investing in trust. We are investing in people who have trust on the ground in their communities. Please work with us and work with governments to enable that to happen in our spaces. To our government folks, we're living in this age of diversity, difference, and division, and we need to take it diversity, similarity to social cohesion. I think it's time for us to have mandatory youth social services where we can have teams of young people from our society, from across the diversity that we have, working on the same issues, working on the environment, working on health, working on things that makes them feel belonging to each other and to the country. And the money from the Pentagon can pay for that, from the Pentagon audit can pay for that. it's important that we rethink and reimagine, but we also all need to come together and think about the spaces and roles we have. And for the lawyers in the room, we passed a law in this country in 2017. It's the Women, Peace and Security Act. And it talks about how when the United States is involved in any conflict everywhere, which, by the way, they're involved in everywhere, sadly, that they have to engage the local women in the peace process. And in the context of Afghanistan, they did not do that. And so if we have any lawyers in the room who would like to take to task envoys that we've had who did not abide by the law, let's talk about it. Because what's the point of having laws if somehow, as a country, we have an exception to ourselves, and as people who think that they're above the law can practice what they want without any consequence? No other sector can do that. So we need to hold these laws and make them real in our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Some very practical guidance. I mean, I think the law needs to be taken at its word. And thanks also, Avila, for raising the issue around the importance of drama in terms of shifting our mindset. I want to just give you the last word, before me, that is. Shamil. Yeah, what would you like to leave us with?
So I do very little of the work now. I mainly run around trying to raise money for people who are a lot more, courageous than I am doing this work on a lot of front lines, both here in the States and in other countries around the world. And so I will share just a couple of the very practical things that inspire me, that I see them doing regularly. The first is just even how to understand the situation. Everybody knows that every community has assets. People from the outside oftentimes look at communities in trouble and don't see all of the assets, all of the real powerful change makers that exist, or they dismiss them because the problem is so large. And a lot of my colleagues, they take this approach, even when engaging across differences, asking some very basic questions. If there's a severe racial divide, is there anyone across these racial divides who you trust? If it's an ethnic divide, is there anyone you trust across this ethnic divide? If it's a corrupt government, is there one government minister that people actually feel is trying to serve the people? If it's an out-of-control police force, is there a captain or a beat cop who actually is on good terms with people? And one of the things that we've seen is that 100% of the time you ask those questions, names come up again and again and again. And when the same names come up again and again, those are the people that we gravitate towards, that we seek to understand, to support, to connect with one another, etc. That exists in every society, and it exists across the very dividing lines that we sometimes draw the devil, as you define the devil. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and I'm quoting Jarvis Williams is here, that I went to the session that Horizons Project did earlier, which was brilliant, and he said something about, to get something done, you don't have to agree on everything. And it reminded me of the core methodology that a lot of our teams apply, or all of our teams apply, which is called the common ground approach, basically. And it was defined once by a very militant anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, right around the time that Mandela was released, when our approach was being talked about. And he stood up literally in fatigues. He was with the Inkatha Buthelezi movement, and he said, I get what you're saying. You're saying, understand the differences, but act on the commonalities. And we probably owe him royalties because we've been using that as a logo, but that ability to say, I'm not going to, and understand, the first part is important. We gotta understand so that it doesn't overwhelm the whole relationship. But when you get to imagination, your imagination becomes so extraordinarily broader and more creative if you're sitting together with people who come from a really, really, really different perspective than you, looking at the same problem.
Thank you so much. I mean, this has been a fantastic panel.
All right. Thank you.